I can't really wrap my head around what people mean when they say they don't believe in the same God. Now, it would be obvious if you have two different images of God and those images are significantly different and obviously distinct from each other, where the properties that are assigned to image A are entirely different from the properties that are assigned to image B. So God A is all loving and God B is like all hating. So then it's obvious. Then it's obvious. Well, these are not the same images, and they don't stand for the same principles. But there is a weird phenomenon that when you ask people who believe in God to give a description of the personal properties of God, they often come up with very, very similar descriptions. Stemming from different traditions, they would say that you can have a personal relationship with God. They would say that God is all loving, all forgiving, that is, God is just, and so on. And you can come up with a very long list of properties. And the interesting thing about these properties is that they are interculturally actually, I wouldn't say universal, but they're pretty similar. And this has made, I think, many atheists like me often just ask a question: why this is actually why then the religious wars? Why don't people get along with each other? Why do people still insist that even though their images of God they believe in are practically identical, this doesn't mean that the other side believes in the same God? Most religious people would still say, well, no, of course, the other side believes in another God, even though the properties are the same that the other side ascribes to God. And this is something I don't understand. What is the reasoning behind this? How can you say that the other side, just because they have taken their God from a different religious text, but still come up with the same properties, how can you then say, no, it's not the same God? It's a different God. How? Like, does God speak in just one language? Does God come in just one set of metaphors at a one specific period of time? This doesn't make sense, because even if you compare the New Testament and the Old Testament pictures of God, they are significantly different, and yet we would insist from the Christian tradition that they are contingent, that they're not different. Those are not two different gods, but there is just one. And this is weird, because if, on the other hand, you have two God images that are basically identical in their properties, people still insist they're not the same. And I have difficulties explaining this. I have difficulties understanding this. One way I could make sense of it usually is offensive to most religious people. And one way one could make sense of it is by just comparing it to other social phenomena and by simply assuming that religion is not something private, but religion is usually a social phenomenon. Well, maybe with the exception of mysticism. If you talk about mysticism, it is an exception insofar as most mystics didn't come together as a coherent group and lead wars. So they didn't fight against other social groups as a unified social entity. Most mystics in all traditions have been rather individualist in their approach, and oftentimes going against the grain and against the overweighing tradition. So with this exception in mind, when you look at social phenomena, and if you assume that religion is a social phenomenon, it's not about you and your feelings, but it's about you, the others, so your group, and your feelings as a collective, and God. And if you look at other social phenomena like warfare, where you have groups coming against each other, and you have social identities, you have two different identities clashing at each other, what matters in social contexts is not that these two groups have to be significantly different in the symbolisms they believe in or the values they believe in. So if you look at the Franco-German wars, I oftentimes wouldn't know, even looking back in history, which side I would identify with, because they seem to me almost identical. When we think of social phenomena, I think we tend to use extreme examples like with Nazi Germany. And then it's pretty much obvious. If you had to choose Nazi Germany or be with the Allies, I think most people would choose, right? It's obvious. It's not a very difficult choice. Even when you have to choose between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, I think most people would clearly know which side to choose. Even though both sides are bad, one is clearly worse than the other. But in most social contexts, I believe the distinction is not as clear as that. Again, with the Franco-German wars, would you side with the French or with the Germans? Not, I wouldn't know. I would have to look up history, and even then, I think I might not know. And if we assume that in this case, the distinction or the difference that makes a difference is not that both sides are significantly different, but that they are two sides, the reality is simply that in social contexts, what is real, the real difference or distinction, is the distinction between the two sides themselves. Not necessarily inherently about the two sides being different, but the fact that people just identify with two different sides. If this is a part of social phenomena in general, very often, and sometimes you just can't tell which side is inherently better or worse, they're just two different sides, they're just two different groups. From this context, the statement, well, even though their God has the same properties as my God, it's still not my God, actually makes sense. Because what people then actually would mean is not that the symbolism is different, that the values represented by the notion of God are different. But what they actually mean with that, but it's not my God, it's not my group. It's still not my group. God, the notion of God in this context, is linked to my social identity. And my social identity is clearly not the other social identity that I'm actually confronted with. And that's a real thing. Social identities are a real thing, and they're not the same. They are different. And what they would be pointing to is a real fact about social reality, which is that we are not you as a group, and you are not us as a group. This would kind of make sense of the statement, well, both God images are identical, but still we don't believe in the same God. So what people would mean here is not that they believe in a different kind of God, but that they identify with a different kind of social group. Now, this kind of contextualization, I believe, would be very offensive to most religious people because it kind of degrades God to having a social function. God is not self-standing and standing up above everything else, but God is actually something that makes social reality possible. So I'm personally also not very happy with this explanation. But otherwise, I can't really wrap my head around it. I really don't understand what people mean when they say, even though they have identical properties, those two images are different. What would this possibly actually mean?